Record. Okay, it's good to see everyone. Welcome. This is our final seminar panel for the semester offered by IALS Venture Development and the Tech Transfer Office. We've been collaborating this year. The topic today is what university startups teams need to know about partnering with and licensing to industry partners. And we've got a great panel here. I have a couple of housekeeping notes. First, you all know me, I'll skip that part. The seminar is being recorded, as you just heard, so if you miss anything, we hope you will go back to the recording and also send those to people who are going to be sorry they missed this. We recommend that you use speaker mode. We're going to have some we have some slides to share just very briefly, and just to show you who's who, but when we start the discussion, speaker mode. Please stay muted while the panel is speaking. We are aiming to be interactive, so please put your questions in the chat. I'll try to remember to ask for questions throughout, and we'll ask you to unmute to ask them. Before we get to the panel today, a couple of just things to keep in mind throughout. You know, there's quite a bit of evidence that startup failures happen for a couple of different reasons, often because there's no product market fit or because there are gaps in the team. Partnerships touch on both of those. So at a high level, I hope you'll listen to those, to connect the discussion to those two issues. More tactically, an extremely important consideration is that startups and large company partners have an inherent imbalance of power, resources, etc. And we'll get to that big question at the end. We'll try to leave time for that at the end, but listen for that throughout, because that's a really important tactical consideration. And we've got a wonderfully well-rounded panel to be able to address those issues. So what I'm going to do is, rather than introducing the panel, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves quickly, and then we are going to get right into it. So let me start with showing you the panel. Luciano Bueno from GALY, who is located among other places in the IALS collaboratory space. Marcia Dougan from Arvinas, Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations, and Sinan Yordem, who is an UMass alum, Polymer Science PhD from 3M. I'm going to let them tell you more about themselves. Luciano, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. So my name is Luciano. Originally from Brazil, moved to US in 2018. My main background is in finance and operations. I worked for Deloitte for a couple of years, then moved to venture capital, did a bunch of mergers and acquisitions deals. Then I quit this whole life to start my first company, which I fantastically failed, but kind of gave the scars I needed to be where I am today. So fast forward, somehow US thought I was special. They gave me the external ability green card. So I moved here and I started GALY with the mission of saving the planet by producing cotton directly from cells, not plants. So yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. Marsha, tell us about yourself, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Karen, for the invitation as well. I'm Marcia Moore. I am a pharmaceutical industry lifer, I guess you could call me. I've been in the business for about 30 years. I started off my career at Bristol Myers Squibb. I was there for about 15 years. I held positions in clinical operations, new market planning, and I was the longtime licensing director for the oncology franchise before I left. I took a few years off and to raise a family, and as Karen mentioned, came back into the workforce working under a grant-funded position at the PVLSI. And once that grant ran through, I joined Alexion as one of their development team leaders. My job there was to actually move products through clinical development and into the commercial space. And while I was there, I became acquainted with some folks who are working at Arvinas. At the time, Arvinas was a startup. It was a spin out of Yale, founded on technology created by Craig Cruz. And we now have grown into a company that has 3 clinical development candidates and about 200 employees.
Sinan, can you give us your background, please?
For sure. And first of all, thanks for the invitation, Karen. It's really great to be on this panel with Luciano, Marcia, and be on the call with the audience over here. So quickly, I'm originally from Istanbul, Turkey. I had my bachelor's degree and master's over there in civil engineering and materials, which led me to really be interested in polymer science. And I had my PhD at UMass in the polymer science department. And I just saw Elle joined the conversation. So it's great to see one of my professors in the audience as well. So during my time at UMass, in the last year, I was an Eisenberg Scholar. Actually, we tried to kick off our own startup over there, through which I met with Karen. And since then, we have stayed engaged. That was back in 2010. Then I joined at 3M, and even though I have only experience at 3M, I have really a broad, I would say, expertise within the company. I started as a technical employee, looking into product development and technology development, but then I started to really focus on more strategic innovation and ventures, working with our new ventures group, corporate ventures groups, startups, which led me to my current path in the last half a decade on the business development and marketing side, where I primarily lead our growth programs in my current organization, looking into the market, looking into the ecosystem, the partnerships, and then from there building up the right partnerships to either accelerate our short-term business successes or lay the foundation for long-term investments. With that, I am really eager to hear the questions and happy to at least call me what I know so far. So thanks again.
Thank you all. We're really delighted to hear. And now that I've heard your backgrounds again, I'm even more excited to have you here. Let's start just with the different kinds of types of partnerships that a startup team might have in mind when it's first starting to think about these. And let me start with Luciano, since he's at that stage where he's starting to think about and catalyze partnerships. So how do you think about partnerships, and what kinds are you thinking about?
Sure. So for us, it's very important to not only validate the technology, but have the market traction. So we can show to our prospect investors that we're in the good path. So that translates into POCs, which is proof of concept agreements, and then go through pilot programs until you go into a more order / JV partnership, which is a more serious one. So I can tell that for a startup, it's very challenging. Typically, the length of business development, it takes 9 to 12 months if you're going to B2B. And most of the times, the startup has 9 to 12 months of life. So you shouldn't depend on that partnership to make your business, become through. But yeah, that's a little bit on my experience, and I'm very focused on the POCs, which is a great way to start the conversation and the kickoff.
Okay, that's great. So you are the little guy trying to take a bite out of the elephant. Let me turn to Sinan as the elephant now. Sinan, how do you, when a startup comes to you and is hoping to get your attention, what are you thinking about in terms of how to, what kind of partnership might be appropriate with them?
Yep. First of all, I want to echo what Luciana said about POCs. That's one thing that's always on top of our list. regardless of the timeline of where we want to see some level of traction, we always want to have a proof of concept or a pilot that will validate the collaboration. So from our perspective, I would say the things that we are looking at is, one, in the short term, we do have some objectives, business objectives that we would like to gain with our existing products or services. How can the startup can help us to accelerate that? Maybe creating a complementary tool or a service or support that will help us to penetrate into that market. If it's a new product or if it's an existing product, maybe position the product differently to create an adjacent business for us. So that's one aspect of it, and I can get into more examples if need be. On the other side, we are looking at from a longer term perspective. We do have a strategic direction for the next 5 to 10 years, sometimes even beyond 10 years, where we do see our businesses, and based on that direction, we look into the gaps that we have so far, and we look into the market and identify which companies can fill those gaps. And we start to discuss with those startups or even sometimes larger corporations too, how they can bring in that value that we are missing today that will position us as a company, as well as us collectively as a partnership into the future. And we look at this really holistically, sometimes between our company and a startup. Sometimes it could be a public-private partnership. Specifically in our business, it's B2B, but also it's B2G. And in certain cases, there could even be a third private entity who can come in to bring another aspect to the equation, or maybe another startup who can bring another aspect to the equation that will make the case stronger. So so in short, those are the areas, but I would say that the POC and validation are really important to demonstrate that, because it helps us to create that case study, and with that case study, it helps us to penetrate into other markets or other customers.
Okay, thank you. So Marcia, I've saved you for last for this question because you've walked both sides of the street.
I have walked both sides of the street. So first, I would say I agree with both Luciano and Sinan. You know, there's multiple ways to look at partnerships, but I think that you need to give a potential partner a reason to believe, whether that's proof of concept or you're on the path to proof of concept. You also need to kind of tailor your pitch, if you will, as Sinan was saying, to whatever you believe that partner needs. How are you going to help them differentiate? How are you going to help them fill a gap in their pipeline? Provide them with technology that will give them an advantage in a market that's important to them. Those are all really critical pieces of information. What I can tell you as working for Bristol Myers Squibb is that any licensing director in a large pharmaceutical company will probably receive over 100 of unsolicited applications a month. So you want to be very concise, and you really want to put your best foot forward. But I would also say be mindful to not oversell. I think if you overreach in that first pitch, it really does diminish your credibility. But you're an expert. You're an expert with your technology, and you should know what it is that's reasonable to expect from it. Let's put it that way. I think on the other side, Arvinas really did do a number of deals early on as a very young company. We are a novel technology platform in the targeted protein degradation space to address unmet medical needs such as cancer and neurodegenerative diseases. And we were really able to utilize our technology and forge relationships with very large companies, so companies such as Genentech and Pfizer, to really leverage the technology. And the nice part about it is that through those relationships, we've actually better understood how to deploy these molecules than we would have if we were just working off of the money that we had raised in the private financing world. So I think there's a lot to think about there. But I would say really customizing and looking at your potential partner and understanding their needs, because that's how you're going to get your foot in the door.
Thank you. That's great advice from all of you. So now that we know that the term partnership really means many different things, how do partnerships get started? What's the best way to approach a large company? Marcia just touched on, do your homework, give them some reason to believe that they should be at least talking to you. But how do you find the right person to connect with? How do you, how do you even go about starting the conversation if you know that the person that people are receiving so many unsolicited requests every month? So let me start with Marcia this time.
Sure. I think there's a couple of different ways to do this, and I think people have different philosophies. A lot of the scientists that I've spoken to have actually started with a scientist to scientist discussion. So whether it's a poster presentation where you're presenting your data for the first time, or you're at a meeting and you're at a networking event and you are introduced to someone who's in a related field but works for a large pharmaceutical company, if you can establish that type of a relationship and generate some interest in what it is that you're doing, you've got a leg up, because now you've got a champion who's pulling for you inside your potential partner company. Of course, the traditional way in, which is through, external development, business development type people. Again, that's a matter of being noticed, right? You need to figure out, how are you going to stand out at the top of that pile of 100? I can tell you that when I had the pile of 100, I usually went for what was short first, because it was either, a yes or a no, and I could make a decision on it relatively quickly. So it does pay to be concise. It does pay to include a little bit of data. Again, proof of concept and helping people understand how to apply and deploy your technology are really, really critical. I think the other thing to remember about business development people is that they're generalists. So you do need to kind of guide them along a little bit. They need a little bit more information than if you were speaking to someone who is an expert in the field that you're working with. So there's a bit of a balance there.
Thanks. So Sinan, when a startup approaches 3M, I'm suspecting it's very different than when a startup approaches a biotech. So what recommended path?
I feel like I'll be echoing most of what Marcia mentioned here, but so rather than maybe recommendation, I'll maybe share my experience, that the path I have seen so far that worked for the projects I'm involved with. So I've seen two different, there are a couple, of course, paths, but there are two paths that maybe we can boil this down to, which are very much in line with what Marcia mentioned. One is, it could be organic engagement through maybe a trade show or a conference, where most of, like for us, both our business and technical teams attend some of the large trade shows and conferences, and we do always seek out for startups or mid-sized companies that may have something new to offer, even sometimes within similar to our product portfolio or something beyond that. And those engagements work really well, because we do have a chance to spend as much as time we want and have quick follow-ups, and the startups will have a quick follow-ups as well. But what really matters in those kind of situations, as Marcia mentioned, is a very articulated, concise, and clear value proposition that they can offer to that company that approach them. And typically, when we go to a conference as a large company, we always scan who's attending and know beforehand who to visit. So if a startup does the same kind of a homework of who are the large players that's in their span of interest, and study them, what is that company's value proposition that they can maybe touch on or add some value to, I think that will be really key. So that conversation helps to move forward. And the two engagements I'm working with right now, two startups, exactly started through trade shows. So the other path is I want to call inorganic, not that it is just to really compare with the organic one. It's really through the startup itself doing with their business development team doing the market analysis and looking into, as we call it, the ecosystem of corporations in their value chain, that depending on what skills or what products or services or maybe a go-to-market channel that the startup needs, and understanding which companies may offer that gap to them, and then strategically targeting those companies. And the way that we typically work at 3MS, our main channel is our ventures group. Like I receive a lot of these requests through LinkedIn, and I take, at least personally, I'm interested in these kind of stuff. So I just take a first look at it. And if there's some need or there's some value, I forward them to our ventures group and they take it on from there. Different companies have different structures, but typically reaching out to someone that either you know through your network or you know that is linked to the ventures group is always a good start. I want to highlight one point over here, as Marsha also said. The credibility piece is very important, because no matter or however the partnership moves, either in a positive direction or it doesn't really work well, the relationship that you initiate, that you start, is going to be there for years. So having that first impression with credible data, with credible information that you can substantiate, that you can show, that you can create a clear message to the company and the value to the company, that is very important. Sometimes the companies look into the leadership team and see the value over there. The technology may not be there, but the companies can help to elevate technology in time, trusting the leadership team themselves. So it's really important to be savvy and to be very relationship focused and to be sincere about that.
Thanks. So Luciano, you've been living this dream of having to attract attention and interest and engage with large companies. What do you have some advice from that point of view?
I can tell you a story.
Please do.
So when we started the company, we had no idea if the product we were looking for to produce would have any market traction. So instead of developing the technology, what we've done, I saw an event in New York, and that event we would have the director of innovations of the biggest fashion company in the planet. So I said, okay, I'm going. In the previous day, I printed out a business card with, random information to pretend that you're pretty big. Then I went there and I talked to 3 directors of innovation, and I said, hey, this is a little bit about what we're doing. I would love to meet in person, et cetera, et cetera. And the main goal was to get their business card. And right after I got the business card, I sent an email saying, hey, I would love to connect. Could you give me suggestions for the next week? So I got destroyed in my first meeting because we had no data, nothing at all. But I learned a lot into what we needed to present into the next meeting. And one thing that is very important to say is that, the large corporations are used to it. So Sinan mentioned, you're used to how startups work. So you can be very transparent and say, hey, I'm just trying to understand if there is a market need here. So I'm more looking for feedback than anything else. So if you go with this approach, I think people will be very welcoming than trying to oversell it and then underdeliver. So yeah, that's a personal story. That's how we started.
Okay, so that's great. And so one theme I've heard from all of you is the data. So let me ask you about the data, because I know that there's at least 1 or 2 people who are listening who are going, data? Well, am I going to have to give away the secret sauce? Am I going to have to sign an NDA before I have even a first conversation? Tell us what you mean by data and give us your best advice for how to do that without having to go through the NDA process and all of that. Marsha, could you start?
Sure. I think it's not a one-size-fits-all answer, Karen. I wish it was. I think that, if you look at whatever summary you're providing to a potential partner and you look at it objectively and you say to yourself, if I were seeing this for the first time, would I find it interesting or exciting? And the answer to that question is yes, then you've put enough information in there for someone to be interested or excited. If you look at it and say, you know what, this looks like a great idea, but I have no concept of where these folks are with this type of project or this technology, then you might not have put enough information in there. And so there is a balance there. I would say that you do need to be careful, especially when you're talking with large companies. I'll give you again the Arvinas example. So Arvinas was the first company founded to look at targeted protein degraders as therapeutic agents. It didn't take very long for large pharmaceutical companies to think, hey, this is a fabulous idea. It's a way to get around some of the challenges with inhibitors. We're going to do this ourselves. And then, a few months later, they're calling Arvinas because they want to discuss a partnership. So you definitely need to be aware, and you certainly need a good attorney. You need someone who's going to be protecting you, making sure that you're asking the right questions about potential conflict of interest. And especially with larger companies, you can request that employees who are working in a similar space be firewalled from your discussion and that they don't see the information that you're providing. And you can make that a contractual obligation on their part. So there are something, I know that's getting to your second question about how do we protect ourselves, Karen, but I do think that you've got to kind of decide what it is that you need to make someone believe that you've got something exciting.
Yeah, so you may not need to disclose the structure of your molecule, but
No,
you're gonna talk about what your molecule can do.
exactly.
Great. Sinan, how does 3M, as the biggest player here, how do you want to receive data from people, and what do you want to hear? You probably don't want people sending you confidential information willy-nilly, but you need something.
Correct. And so we definitely don't want confidential information. So it's this is, as Marcia said, this is two ways, right? Sending the confidential information is risky for the company who is sending it. At the same time, it's risky for the company who is receiving it. So you don't want to be in either end of it unless there is an agreement in place. And in our engagements, we always are very clear in the first meeting or first engagement, like as we set the ground rules that no confidential information will be shared. We are not interested. So that's typically a starting point. That's to protect both companies. And 3M in that case, I would say a very ethical company, always protecting both the entity that we are working with as well as ourselves. But that being said, though, you don't need to share the confidential information to tell your story. And you need to be a good storyteller to really convey your message to the larger company. You can plot a diagram, or you can show some level, maybe an infographic, whatever that works the best to deliver your message without giving away much, but helping you to show your work and show your value proposition. So it is, again, it depends on from company to company. If it's very chemistry oriented company, things may be different. If it's very software focused, things may be different. So there's not really one single answer for sure, but definitely I believe, and I've seen in my engagement with startups or other companies too, you can always tell your story by creating a good summary of what is it that is important in your technology, product, or service. So to your question about what are we maybe looking at to receive from the startups, in the first engagement conversation, we don't expect to receive much. All we want to really hear is the elevator pitch, right? What is it that you provide? What is it that value that will really pique our interest? If it's strong enough, if it's clear enough, then things really accelerate, and we can bring many people on board to hear in more depth. But again, we can get to know about the company, or both companies can get to know each other, just with a high level information that is discreet and clear enough without getting into confidentiality.
Great, thank you. So Luciano, once as the entrepreneur here, once you've successfully gotten the attention of a potential partner, what are the next steps you think a startup should take? You know, what should they be thinking about? When should you bring in a lawyer? How should you prepare for that? The first substantive meeting, all of those, and how should you manage the relationship even before there's an agreement in place?
Yeah, I think that you should first, well, I think most of the times, one of the things that we do in the wrong way is to sell our solution before understanding if there is a need. So we assume there is a need for that product specifically, and we just want to sell it. And we are kind of that person that nobody wants to listen anymore. So every time that I'm in first, second meeting is to more hear about the client and see if our solution could be a fit, because maybe exactly what you're doing may not be a fit. But if you hear, what are the problems there, you can tweak a little bit or pivot into a way that could translate into a better solution for it. So this is the first thing. The second thing is I try to ask for numbers in terms of how many startups you work with, what you hated the most, what you liked the most, what are the main frustrations, because those are the tough questions that nobody asks. But if you ask those, you're in an advantage, because they're going to think, wow, this guy really knows, how the game plays. So I think this is very important, because most of the companies, maybe they have a CVC arm, maybe they do not know how to work with innovation. So you have to understand what level of education they are in that spectrum to see how you can better sell your solution. And the last thing I think is a cultural fit. So, Marcia was mentioning about that challenge on being the first one, and, everybody wants, and Sinan mentioned that, the ethic behind 3M. So it's very important to know who you are partnering or looking to partner with. Otherwise, you're getting screwed and you had no idea. So always look for cultural fit. And you ask this by going through the values of the company, discussing about this, how they see and how seriously they take. So I think that's crucial for any startup before even thinking about going into a partnership. Oh, I'm sorry, just to go on the lawyer thing. So never bring the lawyer to negotiate for you. This is a huge mistake that I've done a couple of times. And so I try to negotiate, and the lawyer will be the one who get the negotiation and provide a document to support that in the best way possible to protect both interests. So that's on the lawyer part.
That's great. Thank you. So what about terms and conditions? Have you found that large companies, does one size fit all from a large company's point of view? Maybe Sinan, maybe you could comment, because I think you probably are the company here that probably has the most likely sort of standard processes.
Yep. So again, there's no one set of rule for terms and conditions, but what we are looking at in a partnership typically is, first of all, what type of agreement that we would like to get in place. And not everything starts with an NDA first. Sometimes maybe we can have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding in place, which is not binding. Then get more involved into a binding agreements as the relationship moves forward. But in terms of the terms and conditions, one thing that we typically are very keen on is the field, definition of the fields. What is it? What are the fields that we believe that falls into our core expertise, our business focus, our products, technology? What is the field of definition for the other companies' skills and core competencies? And there's almost always a white space in between. And in certain cases, we want to define that. In certain cases, we don't, depending on the agreement. If the agreement is more about, it's just maybe, let's say, a pilot project and there's no joint development, so you don't necessarily have to define the white space. But if there's a joint development, then the white space becomes very important, because that's really the trajectory that both companies can go in the future. So that's maybe one area of definition of the fields. The other major, and there are commercialization terms if the arrangement requires any commercialization. There are development terms if the arrangement requires any development terms. But the part that is in most cases very important for us is the liability and indemnification. So how do we make sure that both parties are protecting themselves and each other in terms of any potential failure of the service or the product or whatnot. So the other terms that could be part of it, again, depending on the mutual interest, is publicity. Like in certain cases, you don't want that relationship to be public at all. In certain cases, you want that publicity because there's a value of that brand, of that startup or the other company that you would like to use in your marketing collateral. So again, there's no one size fits all. Typically, the way we work with this, we define a scope, we define the objectives, and we mention to our legal team what are the key criteria we would like to get out from that agreement or from that relationship. And they give us a draft of an agreement, and from there we add terms or remove terms. I would say in almost every case there's at least a couple of rounds of negotiations between the companies. It may take sometimes months to finalize it, but it's important for both companies to get to the right terms in place.
So that goes back to Luciano's point about startups should expect that there's going to be a long time period from first engaging to actually having a partnership, a full partnership in place. Even if you might be doing, might you in the meantime be doing little collaborations to test out the relationship, or do you just wait to have that agreement in place to move forward at all?
That's actually an excellent question. So first of all, yes, the timeline may be really too long, depending on that extent of the agreement you want to put in place. But that piece, if you want to have something that is going on in parallel as a POC or some validation, it really depends on the executive leadership. In certain cases, you may have more conservative business that is more protective, that would like to have everything in place. In other cases, some things could be done with some flexibility and agility, that you want to get those things done in parallel by knowing what you are risking. So at the end of the day, the legal team will always provide you the risks associated with the steps you take, but the business makes a decision unless there is a higher level corporate risk that you are getting into. But the business makes a decision of how you can move forward with this step. So again, it can be both, depending on the relationship and depending on the product or the service in conversation.
Okay, Marsha, how does that work in biotech? You're probably in biotech. You're probably seeing things from academic teams and startups much earlier than you might in an industrial application.
You definitely do, and I think one thing that one needs to be prepared for is a request to test the material. So oftentimes the partner company will request a material transfer agreement so that they can perform certain experiments themselves using perhaps a proprietary model or something that they believe is predictive in a way that the model that was shown to them was maybe intriguing, but not quite as convincing. I think that's something that's relatively frequent occurrence. It's also something that's a bit nerve-wracking, right? So the material transfer agreement, of course, would contain language that would tell the partner company, hey, look, you can't do anything to try to identify the chemical structure of this. And there is a bit of a leap of ethical faith, if you will, that is in fact what's going to happen, and no one is going to be kind of trying to find out anything about the asset that you're not providing them. But I do think that's something that's relatively easy to do. And it's also, you know, it's a good potential way to learn more about your asset. It's a way to test it in a proprietary model. Oftentimes, whether or not the deal moves forward or not, the partner company is willing to provide the data and information about the model. So you can then take that information and build on it, and perhaps create a slightly different package that would be attractive to a different partner if it didn't work out with the first one. So there's a lot of different ways to consider it. I think, as Sinan said, there's no one size fits all. The one thing I would say is that you definitely do need to listen to the partner during negotiations. There are going to be limits, I guess, no matter what you're negotiating for. Every large company has some sort of governance that governs what it is that they can offer for any particular asset. And so if they say to you, look, I can't give you any more money as an upfront payment, they're telling you they can't give you any more money. They're asking you to pull a different lever. And so sometimes, especially if you're talking about a research collaboration or a relationship that will move the product forward and requires participation of both partners, there are different levers to pull, and you need to really think about what's acceptable in those different situations. And it's different for everyone.
So that's a great point for me to actually open this up to everybody who's here. I just want to make sure you all have been very quiet. I don't see any questions in the chat. If you have any questions, we are about to talk about, once a partnership is established, what happens then, what are some of the best practices. But before that, I want to give everybody a chance to ask questions about this phase of actually getting to that point where there is a partnership in place. No? Be brave. Anybody? Thank you, Connor. Here it is in the chat. Would you like to unmute and read your question for us?
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering if Luciano, if you would mind elaborating a little bit more on bringing a lawyer to negotiate and how that went wrong.
Absolutely, have lots of examples. I'll give you the example that happened on the other side of the table with the big corporations, which was very interesting. So we were negotiating with a Japanese company, very different culture, and we had a barrier on the language. So, you know, at the end of the day, the lawyer was the one who knew how to speak in English. So he was trying to translate the needs from, you know, the owner of the company in the best way possible. But he was very aggressive in the negative way. And it's funny because when you're negotiating tough terms, you want to pretty much talk company to company, because lawyers will be very strict to getting the best interest for their client without trying to understand the whole vision of the negotiation most of times. And that was a mess. And I told them that, you know, I think this conversation should be moved forward, not between lawyers, but between the companies, and the lawyers will be adding value later stage. So in the next conversation, the lawyer was more a translator than anything else, because that really affected the negotiation and we almost went away from the deal. So whenever you feel that thing happening, you can just position yourself and say, hey, I disagree how this negotiation is moving forward. Those are a little bit of my expectations for the next one, and see if they like it. They're gonna think that you're very mature and you know what you're talking about. So that's one thing that happened and lots of other examples with investors, relations, other clients as well. But yeah, you just involve the lawyers whenever you're getting into the tough terms and try to get the help, but never negotiate. Never let them negotiate.
So thank you. I have another question, and I'll just read it out because it was sent as a direct message to me, and I don't know if the person wants to unmute. But how do you identify gaps that companies may have and would be potentially interested in a product from a startup or an idea from or a technology from a startup? So any thoughts on how to identify those gaps?
I can maybe just take a first stab at this because I've done that person for the partnerships that we are seeking for. So I have some, at least some limited experience with that. There are a couple different ways to do that. So the way I'll just speak about an example that I've done. So one part to do is you define your value chain from, if it's a B2B business, B2B product or service, you define your value chain all the way from the beginning to the end user. And in that value chain, if you can define individual steps of where there's again, in the case, without giving too much detail, where there is a material supplier, where there is a product developer, where there's a software or a hardware integrator, and then there is a software service provider into the end user, as a for instance. So if you define this whole value chain, and then you start to bring the companies from your own assessment, how they fit into that value chain in those buckets, it really gives you a great map of where you are, where is your core expertise, and what you want to bring to the customer as your end goal. And in order for you to bring the end goal, you can clearly see in that map where other companies can provide you with different skill sets. Sometimes if you're lucky, there's one company that may give you that complementary skill. Sometimes there's more than one. So that's one way to do this if it is just value chain specific. The other aspect that I've used is then you create a more of an ecosystem of your industry that includes all the way from R&D to governments to regulations to policymaking to, if it's more like a cross-functional industry like ours, which is transportation, you have automotive OEMs, you have tiers, you have material vendors, software vendors. When you plot and map this all out and start putting companies in place, and you know if your gap is, let's say, creating a new regulation for a new product or a service you would like to put in the market, then you see clearly which companies or which entities may help you fill in that gap in that ecosystem. There are different ways, but I'm a very visual person, and in my team, we always did this kind of mapping study with getting deeper into these companies and understanding the market really well and building this whole
Uh-oh. I think we missed a bunch.
I think you're on mute.
Oh, can you hear us, Sinan?
Yes, now I can hear you.
We missed the last little, we missed your last sentence, at least I did. Can you just repeat it? Because I have a feeling it was really good.
So I think, well, I have to remember what last sentence was. Well, what I was saying is there are different ways to create these maps, but I found it very useful to lay it out visually and put this in some sort of visual context of mapping the companies with their skills in what they bring to the market, both with their products and also with their relationship in other parts of the ecosystem. And that really helped us to determine which companies or which entities we would like to work with. Again, there is no one way to do this, but these are a couple of ways that we have in the past been successful with our partnerships.
That's great. So is that true with biotechs as well, Marcia, or are there different answers?
I think that they're overlapping and somewhat different. The nice thing about biotechs, at least the ones that are public, is that there's a lot of public information out there about them in terms of their areas of interest, in terms of their research, their portfolio, what it looks like, where they're going, what their stated strategy is. It is a highly covered industry from an analyst perspective, so you can often find a lot of information, especially about competitors and certain companies that might be looking to differentiate in one way or another. You can find a lot of that information in analyst reports. There's also market research reports for various market segments. And then, we, as an industry, we put everything up on our website. So I would say that even prior to Arvinas becoming a public company, we had a very active website that had a whole lot of information, not only about the company, but the types of relationships that the company might be interested in pursuing. And so I think if you, to Sinan's point, you do have to kind of do a little bit of homework and look around to try to see who might be of like-minded thinking in terms of your asset or your technology.
Okay. So thank you. So lightning round. We've got like 5 minutes left. One thing that makes I have 2 lightning round questions. The first one is, once you've started a partnership, what's the most important thing about sustaining it? And, what's your one best piece of advice about sustaining it and really making it work for both parties? Luciano, let's start with you.
Yeah, active communication. So if things are going wrong, raise your hand and say it instead of trying to hide it.
Okay, Marsha?
I think that's a great one. I would say start off the way you mean to continue. So make sure that everyone's aligned on the work plan and that you're moving together. But as Luciano said, communicate, communicate, communicate.
Anything to add, Sinan?
These are all great. If I may, I want to add two things. One is the relationship piece. I think it's important at the end of the day. That relationship really drives the engagement. And second one is the momentum. You want to make sure you keep the momentum, and if the momentum is not there, or if it starts to fade away, you have to acknowledge it and make sure you fix it.
Great. That's just spectacular advice. And nobody mentioned anything about science or technology and any of those pieces of advice. So the last thing is, from all of your points of view, what's the best way to address this for a startup, to address this, fear, you want that partnership, but you're also worried about that huge partner. What's the best way to think about that power dynamic? And I'll start with Sinan and we'll go backwards from big to small this time.
I'll just share my experience other than what our company is looking for. I think for that imbalance, one, I believe both Marcia and Luciano mentioned this too, is really acknowledging and knowing your own value proposition, what you're bringing to the table is very important. So having that differentiating value, differentiating technology is key. And that's usually not very easy to replicate if you define that well enough that you have some niche in that area. Then the other part is, typically larger companies are large, they are big, they have lots of resources, but at the same time, they are very difficult to move. So having an MVP, some minimal viable product that shows that maybe a first penetration into the market, really proving the concept, even with like a small handful of customers, is really key, because that just shows how quickly you can act. To even like Marcia's point, if you can have maybe a bad feedback from one partner, but you can translate it and change it to in your product for a different partner, that agility is really key. So that adaptation, agility, understanding the market dynamics in your commercialization line is very important. One part we discussed in a few questions is the IP. I think IP is important, and that definitely adds a layer of protection to the company. But at the same time, it does not really guarantee the protection 100%. In certain cases, it may not even give you maybe a right to even practice. So it is important. It's definitely critical. but you don't necessarily always have to have it to have a conversation. So just make sure though make sure that the company has that penetration into the market with its own value and channels.
Thank you. Marcia?
Oh, I guess just a couple of additional points to add. One would be make sure you write it down. So have those milestones clearly defined in the contract. And that takes a bit of negotiating. So at what point can you, as the originator, take the product or the technology back because the company has deprioritized or the data has not met their expectation in some way? So you want to make sure that your contract really covers all eventualities for you. And just one additional plug for perhaps alternate funding sources. So I do review for the Cancer Research and Prevention Institute of Texas. They give out grants up to $25 million, and their mission is to fund small startup companies focused in cancer research through what they call the Valley of Death. So there are still sources out there. I know grant money is scarce. The NIH's their budget isn't what it used to be, but there are some charitable foundations and public funding mechanisms that one can also consider.
Yeah, I think that's great advice to do that, and to get as far through the Valley of Death as you can.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Luciano, you get the last word here. It's
Wow.
3:59.
Okay. Yeah. So quick thing. I think the first is watch out for the documents you sign. I remember we were talking with a big player, and under their NDA was saying something that any IP discussed could be co-owned by the parties, which was insane. So watch out for that. Second, be careful about exclusivity deals. It killed my previous business. So always be aware, just gonna exclusivity if there is a lot of upside. And the third is ask for real money on POCs. Most of large companies like to get, materials and etc. But for us to produce a single gram of cotton is very expensive. So I try to translate that into R&D efforts and charge for it. So those are my three last comments.
That's a great way to end. I just want to thank you all for being a wonderful panel. I wish I could share, I've been getting these direct messages saying what a good panel this has been. We will have this recording up hopefully next week. Thank you, and we hope you will come back and do this again with us and for us in the future. So thank you. And I think that's it for the recording, Allison.